All right, now that you've loaded my custom keyboard shortcuts, in theory at least, I want to walk you through the new shortcuts that are available to you, as well as the wealth of shortcuts that are provided to you by Adobe by default, because it's a lot more than you think. And I've documented every single shortcut that there is in these two HTML documents, which you can open in your favorite web browser, either on the Mac or on the PC, where this Windows document is concerned. Now, I have them both open in the background. I'll just go ahead and switch to Photoshop and minimize the application. And you can see these two documents right here. Here's the Windows document, and here's the Macintosh document. And the reason things look a little different on the Mac here is that the menus appear in a different order. But I want you to see how things are arranged from the get-go here. I'll switch back to the Windows document. And notice that every single Photoshop shortcut is shown, both mine and the default shortcuts as well. And so if you're a shortcut enthusiast, and probably what you want to do is go ahead and print this document, which I can do by pressing Control-P or Command-P on the Mac. And I'm working in Chrome for what that's worth. And notice that this is going to consume 37 sheets of paper. So there's tons and tons of stuff here. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and close out of this dialog box. The default shortcuts appear in black, and that is default shortcuts that you can change inside the keyboard shortcuts dialog box. And I'll come to what that means in a moment. My custom Deke shortcuts appear in red. My rejected shortcuts, that is, the ones that I reassign to other commands, appear in light gray and strike through. So for example, right down here, Open As, which only appears on the PC, as I mentioned in a previous movie, I took its keyboard shortcut, I stole it, and I reassigned it to Open as Smart Object, because this is a really great command. It allows you to open any image on disk as a smart object inside Photoshop, and that's Mash Your Fist O. So Control-Shift-Alt-O here on the PC, Command-Shift-Option-O on the Mac. Those are the only shortcuts I changed, not just these two, but just the ones that are listed either in red or in light gray. I have some other colors, however, such as brown, which documents the default shortcuts, that is the ones that were assigned by Adobe, that you cannot edit with the keyboard shortcuts command. For example, you can bring up the new dialog box with your last used settings by pressing Control-Alt-N or Command-Option-N on the Mac. So these are little-known commands that Adobe provides you by default and you can't change. And then we've got blue, which highlights default shortcuts, once again, created by Adobe, that require text to be active. So if you have some text selected with the type tool, these are likewise not editable, and very few people know about them. And then we've got some general notes here. These various triangles indicate the 4 arrow keys, and for those of you who are working on the PC, if you decide to create your own custom keyboard shortcuts, they cannot include the Windows key. They can only include Control, Shift, and/or Alt. Whereas on the Mac, you can use not only Command, Shift, and/or Option, but you can also use the special Control key. So you've got an extra key to work with, which increases your options for assigning shortcuts dramatically. Over here on the Macintosh document, I want to show you that there's one more note, which is that the cloverleaf symbol, which pretty much every Macintosh person knows, but I just want you to know it in case, is that key that also reads Command. So Command K, for example, for general preferences. But did you know that the last used panel, which you cannot change, is Command Option K or Control Alt K on a PC? So that's a shortcut that's available to you by default that you cannot modify using the keyboard shortcuts command. All right, I'll go ahead and switch over here. Now, there is tons and tons of stuff here. I'm not going to walk you through every single one because, after all, you've got this document that you can look at, but I am going to whisk you through a few here. For example, paste in place. I changed from Control-Shift or Command-Shift-V to Control-Alt or Command-Option-V, and that's because I found a better use for Control-Shift or Command-Shift-V, and we'll come to that in a moment. Look at all these shortcuts for filling with a foreground color or the foreground color and preserve transparency or the background color. The history source, for example, you can fill a selection or a layer with the history state that you've identified in the history panel by pressing Control-Alt-Backspace or Command-Option-Delete on the Mac. These are default shortcuts. You cannot change them. They just are the way they are. Whereas the stroke command, which does not have a shortcut by default, I gave a shortcut of Control-Shift or Command-Shift quote. So the single quote or double quote key for all that matter. Content-aware scale is just not important enough to have a shortcut, which is why I took it away and I reassigned it. And you can see what I reassigned it to down here a little bit, notice that I assigned the preset manager, which I find to be very useful for basically managing your pattern presets, your gradient presets, and so forth. I gave it a shortcut that was going unused of Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P on the Mac. I'll go ahead and scroll down here a little bit. Nobody uses the menus command, so I went ahead and took away that shortcut. As I was saying, that's a default shortcut right there. If you go ahead and scroll down, you will find that I assigned a shortcut to brightness contrast because it's so great of Control/ or Command/ on the Mac. And that means that you can bring up brightness contrast with the last used settings. This is the static version of the command, by the way, by pressing Control Alt or Command Option / These shortcuts right here, you can't change, not in the keyboard shortcuts dialog box. I reassigned the color balance shortcut to black and white instead because black and white is so much more useful. And notice down here, I took those shortcuts away from auto tone, auto contrast, and auto color and reassigned them elsewhere. I was telling you I took Control-Shift-Alt-C or Command-Shift-Option-C away from content and aware scale. This is the command that I reassigned it to, trim. And the reason for that, by the way, in case you're wondering, like, what are you thinking? Well, the trim command is a kind of crop command. And so I assigned C to it, reveal all, which will go ahead and reveal the contents of all your layers. You know how you can have a layer that's bigger than the canvas size, and that'll just go ahead and show you all the hidden portions of the layers. I assigned that Control-Shift-Alt-B or Command-Shift-Option-B on a Mac, even though B does not appear anywhere inside reveal all. Well, I decided A, which is at work, obviously, in reveal all. I assigned that to flatten the image because, after all, you're flattening the entire image. You're flattening all the layers. So that gets Control-Shift-Alt-A or Command-Shift-Option-A on the Mac. So reveal all is kind of in the middle. That's why I gave it the B. D for duplicate's pretty obvious. We've got the bracket keys, right bracket for rotating the entire image clockwise, left bracket for rotating the entire image counterclockwise, and so forth. So again, you can look through this document on your own. There's no way to change the fact that backspace or delete is going to delete the active layer or active group. That's just something that's at work inside of Photoshop. I went ahead and created this custom shortcut, Control-Alt-Q or Command-Option-Q on a Mac, to get rid of a filter mask. So the idea is by default, when you create a smart object and you assign a smart filter to it, you get a filter mask, but more often than not, you never use the darn thing. It just clutters up the panel, which is why I created this shortcut. So, up to you if you keep it or use it. I went ahead and added Shift to all those adjustment keyboard shortcuts. So instead of Control or Command/ for brightness contrast, for a static version of brightness contrast, we've got Control-Shift or Command-Shift/ for a dynamic adjustment layer. And then there's Control-Shift-L for a dynamic levels adjustment layer, and M for a dynamic curves adjustment layer. This one I added, Control-Shift or Command-Shift-V for vibrance. And that's an adjustment layer once again, and I did that just because I use the darn thing so very often, and I just figured based on my experience, you'd like that too. But of course, you can go your own way. The commas for smart objects. And then I'm just going to go ahead and scroll down this list. Notice reverse. That will take all your selected layers in the layers panel and reverse their order. And I've given that a shortcut of Control Alt or Command Option left bracket. And if I go ahead and scroll down this list here, notice the blues. I was telling you, blue is a keyboard shortcut that's available to you by default when text is selected. So if no text is selected, Control or Command T goes ahead and invokes the free transform command. But if you have text selected with the type tool, it brings up the character panel instead. So it's a context-sensitive keyboard shortcut. Same with Control M, which normally brings up the curves dialog box. Control or Command M, when text is selected, brings up the paragraph panel. And there's my custom keyboard shortcut, by the way, for flatten image. If you want to flatten the entire image, you press Control-Shift-Alt-A or Command-Shift-Option-A on the Mac. Then we've got all this other stuff that's available to you. There's a custom keyboard shortcut for the color range command because I love it so much. There's a custom shortcut for the feather command of Control-Shift or Command-Shift period, really. But if you're working with a US keyboard, then you'll see the greater than sign on the period key as well. So that's why that appears right there. We've got Control-Shift-Alt or Command-Shift-Option-M for the similar command, which is really super useful. There's Control-Alt-F or Command-Option-F for the last filter with dialog box, which is a keyboard shortcut that Photoshop provides to you by default, and you can't modify inside the keyboard shortcuts command. I've gone ahead and assigned some of my favorite filters with shortcuts that involve function keys like Shift F6 for Gaussian blur. And then we just kind of move through them here. Shift F5 for Smart Sharpen, because that's so very, very useful. I'm going to sort of cut to the chase here because there's just a ton of stuff in this list that's available to you. Notice all these shortcuts from the Channels panel that you can't modify. Just tons and tons of stuff. For example, you can target the red channel by pressing Control-3 or Command-3 on a Mac, assuming that you're working inside of an RGB image. You can load that red channel as a selection by pressing Control-Alt-3 or Command-Option-3 on a Mac. If you have a layer mask, you can show it as a rubylith overlay on screen by pressing the / key. That's not a shortcut that I assigned. That's a shortcut Adobe gave you. When the layer mask is visible, you can hide or show the image by pressing the tilde key. Again, that's Adobe's decision. These are the ones that nobody knows, a lot of them anyway. And in fact, I have to admit, I had to do some research to find a few of them myself. For example, when you have text selected, only when text selected do any of these blue keyboard shortcuts work. You are going to change that text to faux bold, whether you've got a bold style or not, by pressing Control-Shift or Command-Shift-B. And on down the list. We've got subscript by pressing mash your fist plus sign. And then notice down here, if you want to reset your tracking value after modifying it, if you want to reset it to 0, you can press Control-Shift-Q. But that only works on a PC. You Macintosh people don't want to press Command-Shift-Q. And I'll show you why. If I scroll down this list, you'll see just above Toolbox, so we're way near the bottom of the document, you'll see Mac OS shortcuts. And there's a similar item, Windows OS shortcuts, in the Windows document. But these are shortcuts that I only list because they don't really have that much to do with Photoshop. They're just shortcuts that you cannot assign inside Photoshop. For example, if you press Command-Shift-Q on a Mac, which is on the PC, Control-Shift-Q, that resets the tracking value, but Command-Shift-Q on the Mac will log you out. It'll bring up a message asking you if you really want to do it. These guys right here, just dangerous. Notice Force Restart, Command-Control-Power button. That will force a restart of your computer. Now, you will get an initial confirmation that if you say, sure, go ahead and restart, then the Mac will actually quit you out of all of your applications without saving a darn thing, without prompting you to save. This one's even worse. Force logout. If you press Command-Shift-Option-Q, never do that, you Macintosh people. You will just log out without any confirmation whatsoever. You won't save any changes. You'll just log out of your computer. Very dangerous thing to do. But anyway, just want you to see these guys here. I'll go ahead and switch back to the Windows document. We've got various shortcuts that we've talked about in the past for increasing the type size, decreasing the type size as well, and so on down this list. You PC people will see at a point the Windows OS shortcuts that are listed. Again, these shortcuts cannot be assigned to commands inside Photoshop, including Force Quit, which is fairly notorious as Control-Alt-Delete. That's Command-Option-Escape on the Mac. And then finally, we've got these tool keyboard shortcuts. I've added N, which goes unused otherwise, which will select either the blur, sharpen, or smudge tool, depending on which one you use last. To switch between the tools, you press Shift along with N. And then we've got the convert point tool. I just went ahead and added P so that you can switch by pressing Shift P between the pen, freeform pen, and convert point, because I think convert point is really useful. And then we have K. So if you're working with either a curves, black and white, or hue saturation adjustment layer, then you can press K to switch to the targeted adjustment tool. Just those three options, by the way. And then we have a ton of these default shortcuts that you can't change, but you should know about, that are available to you when you're working with the various tools, including your ability to change the blend mode, and so forth and so forth. All right, so there you have it, a long, long list of the many shortcuts that are available to you, both by default and thanks to my custom shortcuts. Hopefully, they'll allow you to power through the software that much more quickly. In the next movie, I'll show you Macintosh people how to modify your OS level shortcuts so that they don't interfere with Photoshop, so everybody gets along. If you're working on Windows, then you can skip to the movie after that, in which I'll show you how to modify a few key preference settings.